He was 61 years old, sitting in a chair he didn't seem comfortable in, wearing the kind of quiet that doesn't belong on a man the whole world once knew as the loudest person in any room. And in that moment, Jim Carrey said something nobody expected. Not because it was scandalous, not because it was shocking in the usual Hollywood sense, but because it was true. Deeply, uncomfortably, unmistakably true. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you probably already knew it. We all did. This is the story of a man who spent 4 decades making the world laugh so hard it cried, while he himself was doing the opposite behind closed doors. A man who earned more money than most countries see in a year, who had his face printed on lunchboxes and plastered across billboards in Times Square, who could walk into any room on earth and have every single person turn toward him, and yet somehow, quietly, persistently, felt completely invisible to himself. To understand what Jim Carrey finally said at 61, you have to go back, way back, to a small Ontario town, to a family that was one bad month away from losing everything at any given moment, to a boy who discovered very early that a well-timed joke could change the temperature of an entire room. Jim was born in January 1962, the youngest of 4 kids in a household where laughter was the one thing nobody had to pay for. His father, Percy, was a gentle, soft-spoken man with genuine musical talent, a jazz saxophonist who had quietly surrendered his dream and settled for an accounting job at a local factory just to keep the lights on. His mother, Kathleen, spent more of Jim's childhood in bed than out of it, battling health problems that never seemed to fully let go. The house was small. The money was smaller. But there was something alive in that cramped space. Something that made young Jim stand in front of mirrors for hours, twisting his face into impossible shapes, impersonating teachers and TV stars until his siblings were crying with laughter. He was 10 years old when he wrote a letter to Carol Burnett, informing her, with complete confidence, that he was already a master of impressions. She sent back a polite form response. He taped it to his bedroom wall like a gold medal. That piece of paper meant everything. It told him someone out there had at least acknowledged that he existed, that there was a place in the world for what he could do. School was never really school for him. It was an audience. Every class was a performance, every teacher a character to be mimicked, every corridor a stage. Kids called him Rubber Face. Coming from most mouths, that could have been an insult. Coming from a boy who had nothing else to call his own, he wore it like armor. Then, the armor cracked. In 1975, the factory where Percy worked shut its doors without warning. His father was in his early 50s with no backup plan, no savings worth speaking of, and 73 rejection letters stacking up over the months that followed. Every single accounting firm in Ontario passed on him. So Percy did what a man does when the world stops offering him options. He took the janitor job. He mopped floors in the same kind of building where he used to crunch numbers for a paycheck. Jim was 13. He watched his father scrub bathrooms and haul trash, and something shifted inside him that never quite shifted back. Within a year, the family lost their home. For nearly 2 years, the Carreys lived out of a Volkswagen camper van parked near the water. Percy and Kathleen slept inside. Jim and his brother slept in a tent beside it, waking up some mornings with frost on their sleeping bags. They washed up in gas station bathrooms. Jim occasionally pulled expired food from dumpsters and heated it on the van's small stove. The whole family worked night shifts at a local factory, earning a few dozen dollars for 8 hours of cleaning. Jim went to high school during the day, half asleep, wearing the same clothes, pretending none of it was happening. He had once been a straight-A student. By the time he was 15, he was barely showing up. By 16, he had dropped out completely to work alongside his father full-time, earning $4.25 an hour. Nights he cleaned floors. Mornings he came home and helped lift his mother out of bed, made her food, sat beside her, and told jokes until she smiled. She called him her little sunshine. He held on to that. He had to. It was one of the only things keeping him functional. His first real shot at performing came when Percy drove him to a comedy club in Toronto called Yuck Yucks. His mother had picked out his outfit, a bright polyester leisure suit she'd seen comedians wear on television. The act bombed. Silence scattered polite clapping, nothing more. But Percy drove him home without a word of disappointment. Just quiet pride. Jim understood something that night. Failing in front of people wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of figuring out what actually worked. He kept going. He scraped together sets at small clubs, eventually earning $20 for a 20-minute show at a place called the Hoft. He auditioned for Saturday Night Live in 1980 and never even got to the room where decisions were made. The producers blocked him before he reached the door. He stood outside that door for years in his imagination, wondering what was wrong with him. What was actually happening was something more interesting. Rejection was stripping away every borrowed habit, every impression of someone else's style, every safe and familiar bit. What was left underneath, the raw, unfiltered, physically extreme, emotionally transparent performer, was entirely his own. Nobody had ever seen anything like it, because nobody had ever lived quite that particular combination of chaos and desperate need to be loved. By 1982, he was performing at the Comedy Store in Los Angeles. Rodney Dangerfield caught one of his sets, liked what he saw, and brought the 20-year-old kid from Ontario onto his national tour. Jim opened shows in arenas. He was earning just enough to eat once a day. The hunger was real in every possible sense of the word. Small television parts trickled in. A sketch show here, a canceled sitcom there. He lived in an empty apartment with no furniture and survived on instant noodles. But he was in Los Angeles. He was on television. He was moving, and moving was the only thing that had ever felt safe. Then came 1990, and In Living Color changed everything. The Fox sketch show was unlike anything American television had produced. It was loud, it was bold, it pushed past lines that other shows circled nervously. Jim joined a cast that included some of the most electric comedic performers of a generation, and somehow, this white kid from a Canadian camper van became the breakout. He created over 100 different sketches across 5 seasons. His character Fire Marshal Bill, melted face, wide deranged eyes, chaos wrapped in a uniform, made people laugh in a way that was almost uncomfortable. You didn't know whether to keep watching or look away. You kept watching. He was earning $25,000 an episode. He bought his first house. By every visible measure, he was succeeding. But the hours were brutal. 80-hour weeks. Physical comedy that left real bruises. He was changing his weight for roles constantly, gaining and losing 20 pounds within weeks. He twisted his ankle during a sketch in 1992 and finished the week performing in pain without telling anyone. To keep the pace, he started relying on stimulants. And underneath the momentum, his marriage to Melissa Womer, a woman who had known him before any of this, was quietly falling apart. She would later say he wasn't the same man she had married. She was right. The fame had moved into the house and taken over the spare bedroom, and then the living room, and then everything. In 1994, 3 films arrived in theaters that permanently rewrote the rules of comedy. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective came first, a movie that cost $15 million and made more than 4 times that. Jim improvised nearly half of it. Alrighty then wasn't in any script. It just came out of his mouth in the middle of a scene, and 1 million people immediately claimed it as their own. The Mask followed, pulling in over $350 million globally. Then Dumb and Dumber, which became a cult classic before the year was over. 3 films. 1 year. 1 face that was now genuinely inescapable. Studios that had spent years passing on him were now throwing open their doors. His fee jumped to $7 million, then 20. His face was on merchandise he had never approved. The world had decided he belonged to them. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he had a breakdown. During the promotional tour for Dumb and Dumber, something cracked. He described it later as the moment the mask stopped fitting. Not the green rubber one, the other kind. The one that smiles even when there is nothing to smile about. He had been wearing it since he was a teenager, cracking jokes beside his sick mother in a camper van. He had worn it so long he had stopped feeling the edges. But now he could feel every edge. He was hallucinating. He was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't touch. He admitted quietly to using cocaine just to keep going. He called himself a manic-depressive clown. He said he felt like he was pretending. He had been on Prozac since the 1980s. He had never talked about it publicly. The low-level despair he described, not dramatic, not explosive, just a persistent gray weight behind everything, had been there the whole time. Through In Living Color, through the 3 blockbusters, through the interviews and the award shows and the merchandise deals. Always there, always quiet, always waiting. The Truman Show arrived in 1998, and for the first time, audiences saw something different. No rubber faces, no cartoon voices, just a man standing at the edge of a fabricated world, realizing with quiet horror that everything he had been told was real was a performance staged for someone else's entertainment. The film cost $60 million and earned $264 million. Jim was nominated for a Golden Globe. He won. But the performance wasn't acting in any traditional sense. The director pushed him past comfort, past preparation, past craft, into something raw. One storm sequence alone took 150 takes. At one point the water on set became genuinely dangerous, and crew members had to jump in. The scene where Truman finally touches the wall of the dome and steps through only needed one take. When he played Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon, he disappeared so completely into the role that the people around him stopped being sure who they were dealing with. He lost 40 pounds. He stayed in character between takes, in meetings, at meals. Danny DeVito had to request breaks from him. In one scene, Jim injected himself with saline solution to physically replicate the symptoms Kaufman experienced during his illness. He wanted the pain to look real because he wanted to actually feel it. He won another Golden Globe. He also lost another marriage. He and Lauren Holly had separated after barely a year together. He said he no longer knew how to connect emotionally when he wasn't performing. He wasn't sure where the performance ended anymore. The years between his peaks and his disappearances followed a pattern that was always the same. Work harder, go further, break something, retreat, surface again. The number 23 in 2007 sent him into a genuine obsession. He started seeing the number everywhere after filming ended, on street signs, clocks, license plates. He went into therapy to separate what was fiction and what was happening in his actual life. He said he wouldn't take on roles that dark again. In 2015, a woman named Catriona White died. She had been, on and off, close to Jim for several years. Her death sent a wave of speculation and legal action through the tabloid world that lasted years. Jim's legal team called it extortion. A court eventually dismissed the case. But the weight of those events never fully left. You could see it in his face during the years that followed. He hinted at retirement. He started painting. Hundreds of canvases, large and raw and strange. He talked about consciousness and surrender and the idea that the self was something constructed rather than discovered. At a Fashion Week event in 2017, a journalist asked him why he was there. He looked into the camera with genuine calm and said, "There is no me. There is just this. Just now." He wasn't being cryptic. He meant it completely. He came back for Sonic the Hedgehog in 2020, then its sequel, then a third. He joked that he returned for the money, that he had bought too many houses. There was probably truth in that. But there was also something else. The director of Sonic 3 had his script printed in real gold ink and sent it to Jim as a gesture. Jim said that kind of thing made him feel alive. Not the gold, the gesture, the sense that someone believed it mattered. And then, at 61, sitting in that chair, he said what he finally said. He said that fame had never once made him feel whole. That the version of himself the world fell in love with was never the version that woke up in the morning and looked in the mirror. That the despair he had carried since childhood, that quiet, low-level, never fully gone weight, had walked with him through every set, every premiere, every sellout crowd, every standing ovation. That Prozac had helped and then stopped helping, and that eventually he had decided he would rather feel real pain than manufactured nothing. He said he had spent his entire career performing his way toward a feeling that kept moving. That every time he reached what he thought he was chasing, it turned out to be a set piece, a prop, a constructed backdrop with nothing behind it. He said he had finally stopped chasing. Here is the thing about Jim Carrey that all those years of watching him somehow failed to make obvious. The reason his performances hit so hard was never about the impressions or the physical comedy or the timing, as brilliant as all of that was. It was because every single thing he did on screen came from a place of genuine need. The boy who stood in front of mirrors in a van parked by the water, turning his face into something worth looking at, was never fully separate from the man on the screen. The jokes were always real. The pain behind them was always real. The laughter he pulled out of audiences was the same laughter he had learned to pull out of his sick mother at 4 a.m. just to get through the night. What he revealed at 61 wasn't a secret, exactly. It was more like a confirmation. The thing we all half-sensed when we watched him go too far in an interview or push a character past a point of comfort or talk about consciousness and nothingness with a kind of exhausted certainty that only comes from having spent a long time actually looking. We suspected that somewhere behind all of it, there was a person who wasn't doing as well as the performance suggested. We were right. He was brilliant, and he was struggling. And those two things were always the same thing, wearing different clothes. Jim Carrey once said that he thought everyone should get to experience great wealth and great fame, just so they could learn firsthand that neither one fixes anything. He said it like a man who had done the experiment thoroughly, documented the results carefully, and was now offering his findings to anyone willing to listen. The world laughed at that. Because of course it did. He delivered it perfectly. But if you watched his eyes when he said it, you could see he wasn't performing. He was just telling you the truth. The same truth he had always been trying to tell, dressed up in every character he ever invented, hiding in plain sight behind every wild expression, an impossible physical gag, and perfectly timed moment of absurdity. He had been saying it his whole life. It just took him until 61 to say it without the costume on.